Hi there, Alison here with another Cab Franc du jour. Today's wine is taking us to the region of Gualtallary in the Uco Valley in Mendoza, Argentina. And we're looking at the El Enemigo 2012 Gran Enemigo Gualtallary Cabernet Franc. El Enemigo was established in 2008 by legendary winemaker and agronomist Alejandro Vigil and Argentinian wine royalty Adriana Catena. The project was born out of the desire to experiment and express terroir by charting a slightly unconventional course while still being anchored in their mutual passion to showcase the character and diversity of their vineyards. While El Enemigo has since expanded its range of wines to include other varieties, Cabernet Franc has been a focus of the winery from the very beginning, and this grape remains at the core of El Enemigo's identity today. Alejandro describes Cabernet Franc as being El Enemigo's backbone, and this grape was chosen to be the center of the brand because of its ability to be a mirror for terroir, something I believe the grape is capable of as well. Today, the winery is working with around 60 hectares of Cabernet Franc vines planted across their vineyards in the regions of Rioja and the Uco Valley in Mendoza. And from this, they are making 5 Cabernet Francs, including 4 Cabernet Francs as part of the Gran Enemigo range. And this is their single vineyard range of wines. And these are coming from select parcels and regions across Mendoza, including the region of Agrelo in Luján de Cuyo, and then 3 different regions in the Uco Valley, Los Chacayes, El Sapillo, and perhaps the most famous of the Gran Enemigo wines, the Gualtallary Cabernet Franc. And the first vintage of the Gualtallary Cabernet Franc was 2010. So indeed, today's wine is taking us to the Uco Valley, and more specifically, the subregion of Gualtallary. While the viticultural history of the Uco Valley can be traced back 300 years, it has only emerged as a powerhouse wine-growing region in the last 25 or so years, as drip irrigation has become more readily available across Argentina, and as winemakers have shifted their focus towards quality over quantity, seeking out cooler sites and less vigorous soils. Stretching around 125 kilometers from north to south, the Uco Valley can be divided into 3 subregions. We have Tupungato in the north, Tunuyán in the center, and San Carlos in the south. And the area under vine across the region is nearly 30,000 hectares. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the most planted variety in the Uco Valley is Malbec, and it accounts for around 55 to 60% of the vineyard plantings. However, this is a very important region for Cabernet Franc. In fact, I might argue that it is the most important region for Cabernet Franc in Mendoza and Argentina. This region has been the epicenter of the majority of the growth in Cabernet Franc plantings across Argentina over the last 20 years. Currently, there's around 756 hectares of Cabernet Franc vines planted here in the Uco Valley, and that accounts for around 55% of the Cabernet Franc planted in Mendoza. Located in Tupungato, the subregion of Gualtallary is likely not only the most famous subregion in the Uco Valley and Mendoza, but perhaps even the most famous subregion in all of Argentina, which is pretty impressive because this region was only first planted to vine back in 1992. Despite its prestige, Gualtallary is not yet an official GI, or geographical indication. This is in progress, and it has been in progress for some time now. And part of the reason for the delay is how diverse the terroir landscape is across this region. In fact, some producers are proposing that Gualtallary be divided into 4, if not 5, separate GIs. The main viticultural area in Gualtallary, which ranges in elevation from around 1,080 meters to 1,600 meters above sea level, it stretches around 15 kilometers from east to west and is about 10 kilometers from north to south at its widest point. And the Las Tunas River marks the southern border of Gualtallary. And currently there's around 2,250 hectares under vine here. In terms of climate and soils, we can roughly divide Gualtallary into 2 zones. We have the lower elevation zones, and these are in the easternmost part of the region. And this is where we find vineyards at around 1,100 to 1,300 meters above sea level. And the climate across this area would be classified as Winkler Index 2 to 3. So that's kind of on par with Bordeaux on the cooler side, and then getting into Rioja, the Northern Rhone, and and even Napa Valley in some pockets in terms of temperatures. And then in terms of soils across these lower elevation zones, we tend to find richer, more fertile soils, a mix of clays and sands. In some cases, there are pockets of more gravelly soils closer to the Las Tunas River, and there's virtually no calcareous content in the soils at these lower elevations. This particular part of Gualtallary has become known for softer, fruitier wines, but with very balanced freshness. Now, as we move west into the Andean foothills, this is where we get into the crus of Gualtallary, and namely the two areas known as Gualtallary Alto and Gualtallary Monasterio. And these two zones are at higher elevations, around 1,350 to 1,550 meters above sea level. And the climate of this area would be classified as the Winkler Index 1A to 1B. That's climate conditions similar to that of Champagne, Burgundy, the Willamette Valley, Marlborough, even the Loire Valley to a certain extent. Now, in terms of soil across this area, we find much poorer soils, generally less vigorous soils and more complex soils as well. And we'll find a mix of sandy loams and silt loams here, generally with a very high concentration of calcareous materials in them. Mostly these very large river stones that have this covering of calcium carbonate. And some vineyards will have up to 40% limestone content in the soils. Now, this particular part of Gualtallary, these crus, they have become known for wines that have tension, that have focus, structured wines with firmer tannins and very bright, very elevated acidities. Now, drilling down to today's wine, it is worth noting that El Enemigo is one of the most significant producers of Cabernet Franc in Gualtallary. They're working with about 34 hectares of Cabernet Franc vines here, about 27 hectares in the Gualtallary Medio zone, and about 7 hectares in the Gualtallary Alto zone. The Gran Enemigo Cabernet Franc is coming from the Gualtallary Alto zone, and specifically from a single vineyard site, the Adriana vineyard. And this vineyard is in fact owned by Catena Zapata, and it's from about 4.7 hectares of vines. This vineyard is located at around 1,470 meters above sea level, right at the edge of where the Gualtallary Alto meets the Gualtallary Monasterio zone. The Cabernet Franc plantings were planted by Massal Selection in 1994 at a rather high density, 10,000 vines per hectare. And then in terms of soils, what we have here are deeper soils, about 2 meters depth in terms of the soils. And we have a silt, clay, sand mix with a very high concentration of these large river stones, these large calcareous stones. And the pH of the soil is a bit more on the higher side, basic 7.4 pH to be specific. Now, in terms of the vineyard practices, the vineyard is farmed sustainably, and they do have drip irrigation installed, and they have paid close attention to the biodiversity of this site and enhancing the biodiversity of the site with cover crops and other crops kind of planted throughout the vineyard. And they did convert this vineyard eventually to organic viticulture, and it's been farmed certified organic since 2018. Now, looking at the winemaking for this wine, it is important to note that all of the Gran Enemigo wines have a soupçon of Malbec in them. So this wine is 85% Cabernet Franc with 15% Malbec. And the fruit for the wine is harvested by hand in 5 separate passes through the vineyard over the course of about 6 weeks. And this is to get kind of different profiles in terms of the grapes. And most of the fruit is destemmed. About 70% of the fruit is destemmed. 30% is left whole cluster for the 2012 vintage. The fermentation vessel of choice here is concrete, and the fruit undergoes a cold soak in advance of alcoholic fermentation. And the alcoholic fermentation is done with indigenous yeast. The approach to extractions here is infusion. You know, they are taking a very gentle approach. So very little by way of cap management, just a little light wetting of the cap as needed during the fermentation. And the total time on skins is around 23 days. After the post-fermentation maceration, the free-run wine and aged wine, or the pressed wine, I should say, are aged in a 100-year-old oak foutre for about 15 months before bottling. Now, just before I get into the tasting notes, I should remind you that this is a 2012 vintage Gran Enemigo Gualtallary Cabernet Franc. This is a cellar raid for me. In fact, this is the very first bottle, the very first Cabernet Franc from El Enemigo that I ever purchased. My very first Gran Enemigo that I ever purchased as well. I think I purchased it back in 2017 or 2018 when I was living in Miami. So I've been holding on to this one for a while, so I'm pretty excited to tuck into it. So what was the 2012 vintage like? Well, it is characterized as a vintage about concentration and balance. So the yields were down quite a bit for 2012, around 40% lower than normal. There were some heat spikes during the summertime, and they thought that was going to push up the harvest date a little bit. However, there was a big cool down leading up to harvest, the last 6 to 7 weeks leading up to harvest. And that allowed the growing season to be extended, and that helped to preserve acidity. So the wines have a lot of concentration, but really wonderful balance in terms of the acidities. So let's dive into this 12-year-old Gran Enemigo Gualtallary Cabernet Franc. Okay, so the nose has a really nice perfume to it. And I would say it definitely leans a little bit more on the fruitier side. It is a fruit-forward style of Cabernet Franc. And I'm getting some nice evolution here, so we are starting to see some of those tertiary notes come through in a nice way. And there is a definite ripeness to the nose and a sunny character from the nose. You can tell that it's coming from someplace with a lot of sunshine. And I should note as well, one of the defining elements that makes Argentina so interesting from a viticulture and winemaking perspective is the altitude factor. And it's important to remember that as we increase in elevation, we get more intense sun exposure. And that sun exposure is causing thicker skins on the grapes. And in the case of red wines in particular, that is causing increased concentration in the tannins, as well as the color, as well as the flavors, phenolics, anthocyanins. So it's really like kind of turning up the volume on the varietal character in the different grape varieties that are grown at these elevations. So that's always something that I like to keep in mind when I'm tasting Cabernet Franc from Argentina, is they all tend to have a little bit more amped up kind of profile in general. So there is a sunniness to this wine, but the fruit profile is more on the red fruit side. Like cherry, there's a little bit of strawberry here. And I would say sweet cherry, sour cherry, there's a little bit of kirsch. There's even like almost like Luxardo maraschino cherries in syrup. Yeah, there's a really lovely, I would say fresh and dry. Like there is a little touch of a dried cherry note, but there's still a lot of freshness to the fruit. Touch of red plum here as well, but definitely more fruit forward, though there is an underlying herbaceousness that is kind of taking a little bit of a backseat, but you do know that it is Cabernet Franc. I love the herbal profile. I would say it leans a bit more on the spectrum of garrigue, so some mountain herbs, marjoram, thyme, stuff like that. There's a little bit of like a cypress or eucalyptus type note. There's a really lovely floral profile to the wine as well, like a succulent purple flowers. There's a nice spice profile as well to the nose. Yeah, and that's varietal spice coming through. Remember, this was aged in very old oak foudre, so there's no real barrel influence here. So that's Cabernet Franc varietal spice coming through. And I love the profile. There's a touch of a chili flake thing, like espelette pepper. But there's also some allspice. There's a little bit of cinnamon stick here as well. But great purity to the nose, really intriguing. You sense that there's a lot of concentration here, but there's also a sense of concentration of the acidity. You can smell the acidity on this wine, like it's just kind of leaping out of the glass in a really nice way. On the palate, those same plusher, kind of riper fruits come through in a nice way, but I would say the palate actually leans a little bit more on the herbal, savory side of things, which is really nice. It's providing a nice counterpoint to the more plush fruitiness to the nose. And then you're starting to get into some really beautiful layers in this wine. This is why we age Cabernet Franc, is for wines like this and experiences like this. There's a little bit of dark chocolate, a touch of green coffee bean. There's a little bit of that sweet cured tobacco thing going on, which I love when Cabernet Franc does that. There's a touch of a hibiscus note as well, a little bit of licorice, a touch of leather, and then I would say on the finish, there's a little bit of that very classic graphite pencil shaving kind of mineral undertone to the wine. The acidity is really, really beautiful. It's very bright, very elevated. There's a really nice, refreshing, mouth-watering kind of element to the acidity. Yeah, the acidity is great. Very persistent, kind of hits at the top of the jaw here, but it is very cleansing in a way. And again, it's providing this wonderful counterpoint to the fleshier, kind of riper profile of the fruits. The tannins are lovely, very velvety. There is definitely a ripeness to the tannins for sure, a roundness. There's kind of this wonderful spherical nature to the tannins, but they're velvety in texture, and it's like a plush velvet, like a nice kind of thick, beautifully luxurious texture in terms of the tannins. And they do have a little bit of a chalky kind of tug on the finish as well. Yeah, I am digging this wine today. It's in such a terrific spot. And I love the palate arc of this wine and just the whole kind of flavor profile experience, from the nose that leans more fruity to this palate that kind of starts fruity and then it leans into this beautiful kind of savory space, and then it finishes with this lovely kind of graphite mineral kind of undertone at the end. It's really, really lovely, very harmonious, super balanced. Now, the wine is full-bodied. There's no denying that. It does have a plushness and a certain opulence. I wouldn't call it bold per se, but there is a little bit more volume to this wine, a little bit more voluptuousness, but that is balanced by some really wonderful finesse and restraint and poise. And I think it's doing a beautiful kind of dance in between those two elements. And really, it feels really authentic to me in terms of Argentina and what I expect of Argentinian Cabernet Franc. And it's just such a great example of what is possible with Cabernet Franc when you put a lot of thought and time and energy into the farming, but also into the winemaking. And this is truly one of the great Cabernet Francs coming out of Argentina. And I said from the top, I've been hanging on to this wine for some time now in my cellar, and this is the first video of the year, and I really wanted to kind of kick the year off with a bit of a bang, with something special, like a blockbuster kind of wine. And Argentina is a region that I intend to put a lot more energy into my tastings and reporting, because this is a really, really important region, emerging region for Cabernet Franc. There's nowhere else in the world that is planting Cabernet Franc at the rate that the Argentines are planting Cabernet Franc. And for that reason, it is on my radar. And I wanted to kind of kick the year off with not only an Argentinian Cabernet Franc, but one that is, well, it's the OG. It's the original. There's no one else in Argentina that I would consider to be the flag bearer of Cabernet Franc other than Alejandro Vigil. He is the one that kind of got the ball rolling. And this is really the wine that kind of got the ball rolling for Cabernet Franc in Argentina. And he's really set the stage and shown what is possible for Cabernet Franc at that super premium level. And in particular, it demonstrates that super premium Cabernet Franc does not need to be, 15% alcohol and see 100% new oak. This is 13.9 alcohol. It was aged in Old or Foudre. So it just shows how beautiful this grape can be when it's allowed to be, a vehicle for terroir, be a mirror for terroir and express place in a really authentic way. So this is in a beautiful spot. If you have a 2012 Gran Enemigo Gualtallary Cabernet Franc in your cellar, it's drinking beautifully now, but I would say you've got at least another 10 to 15 years in this bottle, perhaps even longer than that, but it is in a really, really beautiful space at the moment. So it was a pleasure to open this wine today and kick off the year with something special. And if you have had the pleasure of tasting the Gran Enemigo Gualtallary Cabernet Franc, or perhaps one of the other Gran Enemigo Cabernet Francs, I would love to know what you thought of those wines in the comments below. Or if you have another favorite Argentine Cabernet Franc at the super premium level, perhaps, I would love to know what that is in the comments below. And of course, as always, I'll be back again soon with another wine. Cheers.